all, this is Umel from UmelGaming, and I'd like to welcome you back to another Monster Hunter Stories 2 Wings of Ruin video. Today's video is going to be the first in a series of guides for Monster Hunter Stories 2, going over the gameplay. The focus of today's video is going to be on the basics of combat, so let's get into it. Monster Hunter Stories 2 is a turn-based RPG that follows a rather unique formula. When you first load into the fight, you'll notice that your party consists of you, a Monstie companion, and potentially another AI companion and their own partner Monstie known as a Battle Buddy. So looking at the battle HUD, you'll notice that your party's information is all located down at the bottom of the screen, whereas your enemy's information is all located at the top. And on the left-hand side of the video is where you'll find the battle menu. There are various options in the battle menu, and we'll be going through them one at a time, starting from the top down. The first option, however, is the ride option, is currently grayed out, so I'll loop back around to this option when I get to it later on in the video. So starting with the second option on the list, we have the fight option. And when you hover over this option, you will see an attack type wheel. On this wheel, you have power, technique, and speed. And it is essentially rock, paper, scissors relationship with these attack types. Power beats technique, technique beats speed, and speed beats power. After selecting an attack type, you will get to choose which enemy, and in some occasions, which part of an enemy you want to attack. I'll discuss more about part breaks in a more detailed video later, but essentially, if you and the enemy are attacking each other, you'll see lines showing which enemies are attacking you, and if you both attack each other, the line goes from blue to orange. And when you have an attack each other at the same time, you get what we call a head-to-head. And whoever wins this head-to-head with the superior attack type from the attack type wheel will gain advantage on their attacks. So obviously you want to try and judge what kind of monster, whether it's a speed monster, a power monster, or a technique monster, and you want to attack it accordingly. Under the fight option is where you'll have your rider's skill list. The skills available in this list are dependent on what weapons you're using, your rider's level, and some side quests even have skills for certain weapons as rewards for completing them. The first option will be to switch your weapon, which can be done by pressing X on the battle menu, as well as through the skill list. And this brings me into my next major mechanic. Outside of the 3 attack types, you also have the 3 weapon types. You first have slashing weapons, which are your great sword and your sword and shield. You have your blunt weapons, such as the hammer and the hunting horn. And finally, new to Monster Hunter Stories 2, you have piercing weapons like the bow and the gun lance. Different monsters and different parts on those monsters will have different resistances to different weapon types, so matching up your weapon types to that monster and the part that you're trying to attack to try and get one that actually does more damage to it rather than one that they have a resistance to is a more effective way of fighting. Don't just use a sword against everything. If something's resistant to slashing, switch it up and try a blunt or a piercing weapon. Now, each of the 6 different weapon types play drastically different and have different skills, so that's a topic for another video and is intended to be my next guide video over the 6 different weapon types. But before I leave this, I also want to touch on the fact that head-to-heads play heavily into weapon types, and so on the topic of head-to-heads, that will also be covered in that weapon video. Underneath the skills option, in the battle menu, you'll find the Monsties option. From here, you can choose certain skills that are available to your Monsties that you get from their genes, either from birth or from the Rite of Channeling. Now, the Rite of Channeling and genes is a very complicated system, and it warrants its own video, so I won't go too depth into that here. You can also cancel any orders that you give from this list, and just like with weapons, you can also choose to swap your Monstie. Now, swapping Monsties, like swapping weapons, also has a shortcut in the battle menu, this time just being the Y button. And in the case of both swapping Monsties and swapping weapons, both can only be done once per turn, so make sure that you really want to swap either of these weapons or Monsties before you actually do so. In order to use either weapon skills or Monstie skills, you'll need Kinship gauge, which is the circular gauge found in between you and your Monstie's health. As the two of you attack and win head-to-heads, you'll accumulate kinship points, and with some exceptions to this rule, and you can also use those same kinship points to execute skills, once again, being the weapon skills and Monstie skills. But there are also exceptions to this rule regarding weapons. Once again, this will be touched on in my future weapons guide. Should your kinship gauge reach full, you can finally select the ride option that was grayed out at the top of the battle menu. Upon riding your Monstie, your rider will be healed, and your monster will also be healed based on the rider's health. In this state, you cannot use weapons for obvious reasons, and you cannot swap monsties also for obvious reasons. You can, however, use your Monstie skills, but the main focus you should be doing here is leveling up your kinship gauge by attacking with the attack type wheel and winning head-to-heads. By winning head-to-heads while riding your monster, you can level up your attack gauge, which starts at level 1, and you can go all the way up to level 3. And you can spend your kinship gauge at any point in time to use what we refer to as the kinship attack. Think of that as your ultimate skill, dependent on whatever monster you have out. Now, the potency of your kinship attack depends on the kinship gauge level, but no matter when you use it, your kinship gauge will be completely decreased to 0, and you'll eventually stop riding your monstie. Underneath the Monsties option in the battle menu, you'll find the items option, which in traditional RPG fashion will allow you to use items that you brought into combat with you during your fight. You can have various healing items and traps prepared, and in traditional Monster Hunter fashion, you can go out and gather materials out in the wild and use those to craft the materials and the items that you'd use in this menu. The final option in the battle menu is the runaway option, but not every fight can be ran away from, such as arenas and boss fights. Now, just below the kinship gauge, you'll notice that you'll have 3 hearts. These hearts are your party's lives, quote unquote. Upon either of your monstie's death or your own death, you'll consume a heart container before returning to full health. If you run out of heart containers, it is game over. Be extra careful, because heart containers do not regenerate upon the completion of the fight, but instead will require items such as vital essence, talking to certain NPCs in places like feline burrows, or returning to villages before they actually regenerate. Finally, the last thing I want to mention in this video has to do with your AI companions, aka the battle buddies. Unlike you, which you completely control, and your monsties, which you can control with the Monstie menu, your battle buddies and their Monstie buddies are all completely AI dependent, and oftentimes they can do stupid things that will require you to keep an eye out on them and be prepared to step in, and this can be a cause of frustrations. Another thing to note about battle buddies is that they have their own kinship gauge and they have their own hearts. So that's another thing you have to watch out for when in fight. Obviously, in the co-op sections of the game where you can play co-op with other people, they'll essentially be replacing the battle buddy, and in which case you can kind of let them handle their own kinship gauge, but at the same time, you don't want them to reach 0 hearts because that's still a fail, so you're going to want to make sure that you watch not just yourself, but whoever your buddy is in that fight. Anyway, this is it for the basics of combats in Monster Hunter Stories 2: Wings of Ruin. If you enjoyed the guide or found it informative in any way, please like, comment, and subscribe. You know how it is on YouTube. The next guide I plan on covering in this series is going to be an in-depth guide into the 6 different weapon types, their respective skill systems, and how the head-to-head system plays into these weapon types. Until next time, this has been Umel from UmelGaming, and remember, happy hunting.